So today we are honoured to have Millie share a little bit about her research that she's done into autism. We're going to be talking about what the current research reflects about autism, and also look specifically at the research that Millie did and some of the findings in her research, and also looking at the practical piece of this, which is how does those findings translate into practice? How can it be implemented? So Millie, tell me a bit about autism generally. What's research saying?
Okay, so I'll give you a bit of an overview of autism to start with. So autism is a neurobiological disorder which is characterized by deficits in socialization, communication, and rigid and repetitive behaviors. So this is important to keep in mind because a lot of the research that is done is focused on these three or two really core impairment areas. So recently it's now socialization and communication are being looked at together, and rigid and repetitive behaviors are also looked at separately. But in Australia, we actually saw our last survey saw the autism rates in the last 3 years rise 43%.
Wow.
Yeah, so we're
I
seeing...
didn't realise it was that big.
It's really interesting actually, because I was shocked because I'd read the 2012 statistics, or the survey from 2012 which came out in 2014. And then recently I just read the 2015 statistics which came out in 2017, and this 43% rise is just phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. So we're seeing that in Australia, and this is happening mostly with our kids, and it might be due in part to awareness of autism coming out. It might also be due to some environmental factors. So there are a few reasons for it, but most of the time autism is conceptualized as a genetic disorder. So it's one that's highly heritable, but at the same time there's this component, there's this variability when we look at it, that it could be due to environmental factors as well, and what's going on in our environment basically. So that's what autism is looking like in Australia at the moment, and it's taking quite a strain on the school environment. I've interviewed a lot of teachers about it, and that's what my master's research was focusing on. But I'll touch on that later. But it's taking quite a strain on the school because these beautiful individuals with autism don't function as typically developing kids do in that school environment. And so it's really difficult to try to tailor a school environment to cater to typically developing individuals who might learn in a linear fashion, and tailoring it at the same time to one or two individuals on the spectrum who learn in a completely different way. So we're seeing teachers struggling quite a bit with that, just to manage that. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about. I want to equip and empower teachers to be able to look at children with ASD and be able to deal with those behaviours or those impairments in a way that's functional and a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think really is part of knowing how to deal with children with autism is actually understanding how their behaviour manifests in classroom context. So what would that child look like in school and in a classroom?
Well, again, it depends whether the child is a male or a female. So the autism ratio from male to female is 4 males with autism diagnosed to every 1 female. And that's roughly the statistic that's international. So that's quite global, that statistic. And it's really interesting because what females present with autism symptoms might look completely different to what a male might present with autism symptoms, because they're very different. Females tend to hide their autistic symptoms. Females tend to suffer a lot from anxiety, that's social anxiety. We did some research recently into adolescent girls on the autism spectrum, and what we found is that they internalize their anxiety, so their social their social mannerisms and their social skills don't seem to be as apparent, but it comes out in the form of anxiety and depression. So these poor girls are so crippled with social anxiety that they just completely withdraw.
Yeah.
Because they don't understand and they can't conceptualize behaviors and emotions like a typically developing individual would, or they struggle with that. So a girl might present more anxious than a boy. But that being said, boys on the autism spectrum in a classroom can present very anxious. And we're seeing a lot of the challenging behaviors that we see are a lot of the meltdowns. A lot of people use that term, meltdowns, coming out of that place where they're so anxious of their social environment, because everything we do, everything we see, everything we say is embedded within a social environment. And when you don't have the skills to navigate that social environment, then that can really impact you. And imagine walking into a room where you don't know anyone. And you're just standing there, you don't have the skills, you don't have the capacity to go and introduce yourself to someone because you don't know that that's what you're supposed to do. You don't know that that's expected of you. So you're just frozen. You don't know what to do in that environment. And I feel like, and I've spoken to a lot of kids and adolescents on the spectrum who feel like this all the time, who feel like they don't understand what's required of them. They don't understand their social environment. So that's where we see a lot of these challenging behaviors. So one thing that we have trained teachers to do is recognize that behavior. And that's what is one of my passions as well, is not reprimanding the behavior and saying you're doing something distracting, you're doing the wrong thing, is acknowledging that their behavior is coming from a place that might be anxious, that might be, oh, I had a terrible night's sleep last night and this is really impacting my behavior. So I guess it's just asking the question, what is this child's behavior saying? Why do they want this? What's the purpose and function behind the behavior? And using that to deal with the behavior effectively and really help alleviate some of that anxiety that children on the spectrum feel day to day in a classroom setting.
Yeah, and I can imagine, if you're a child and you struggle with understanding or navigating social cues and emotional cues, a classroom environment with lots of children can be highly triggering. And so it's not a controlled environment where you're coming in to an environment with adults who recognize and know how to relate to you. So a classroom context where you have many factors that are uncontrolled and unpredictable, like other children's behavior. And there are children who are learning how to manage their emotions in the classroom. There are other children who don't have autism but struggle with social interaction, and so you put that in the mix, and so you have this dynamic that's very difficult to navigate for the child, but also I think for a teacher can be quite complex to manage. So there's all these pieces, and I think it's really good to actually break it down, like you said, is number one, recognize the behavior and actually take the time to actually think about what's this behavior telling me.
Exactly right.
And that's actually a skill, and it's about learning to raise your awareness and your consciousness around that child's behavior and what their child's behavior is communicating, not depending on words necessarily, not depending on the words to communicate with you, because they're not able to do that.
Sometimes, definitely. They struggle with communication. And I see what you're saying totally, because childhood is a battleground for every child. So you have not just children with autism that struggle socially or academically or emotionally or physically, but you have every child that goes through these challenges that struggle with these, and they're learning, they're growing, they're developing who they are at the same time. So there's going to be lots of dynamics, lots of struggles in that environment.